Elizabeth is a princess who has just been called out in a banquet hall by her fiancé, Prince Fried. He says he is dissolving their engagement because he believes Elizabeth pushed his darling, Sylvia, down the stairs, so in other words, he wants to crack Sylvia. Elizabeth has no idea what he's talking about since she did absolutely no such thing, but Fried is too self-absorbed to care about a word she has to say, so on top of rescinding their engagement, he also sentences her to confinement in the dungeon. Elizabeth had been engaged to Fried for many years at this point, and she was fully invested in their relationship and did everything she could to improve herself so she could support him. She even ended up taking on a bunch of tasks that were meant to be the prince's job, and she didn't even question it at the time. Her maid would constantly warn her not to stay up too late at night because it's bad for her health, but Elizabeth would say she just needed to finish one last report because the prince was too busy with a meeting to do it himself. However, that meeting she was referring to was more of a party than an obligation, so basically, the prince had offloaded all his work onto Elizabeth so he could go have fun. At this point, Elizabeth was still trying to convince herself that all this was perfectly normal, so she told her maid she was fine with the way things were since she actually got things done a lot quicker when the prince wasn't around. Also, she's not doing it just for Fried's sake, but rather for the sake of the subjects, because she doesn't want them to have to suffer if matters like this are left unattended. On top of handling all the prince's political affairs for him, Elizabeth also runs a company known as Funnel Corporation, and it has been doing really well lately, so Elizabeth plans to expand so they can hire more employees. The whole reason she created the company in the first place was so she could give back to the community, and use it to partake in philanthropic activities to help the poor. As a result of all her kind actions, Elizabeth has become quite popular amongst the townspeople, and they all say they'd love to thank her personally for all her help. But Elizabeth has always been too embarrassed to receive direct praise, so she has never actually revealed herself as the one behind the Funnel Corporation, and as such, no one recognizes her as she's walking by. And she was perfectly fine with things this way because she only wants to make the people happy and couldn't care less about receiving praise or recognition for it. The next day, while Elizabeth was busy with another large pile of paperwork, the prince finally rolled out of bed and came into her office to tell her that the Jacko Corporation, the ones who invited him to that party the other day, are requesting access to the royal treasury to expand their business, so he wants her to write up the appropriate paperwork for it. However, Elizabeth immediately tells him she's not going to approve such a request. She had looked into the Jacko Corporation, and she found out that they'd been skimming a lot of profit off their books lately, so if they were given access to the royal treasury, they'd no doubt start skimming there too. The prince becomes annoyed when she says that because he is trying to impress his new friends, and if Elizabeth rejects their proposal, then it's going to ruin his street cred with them. He tells Elizabeth to just do as he says because she's just his fiancée, but Elizabeth doesn't back down because she knows the rules are on her side, and agreeing to such a request would harm the royal family's reputation as a whole, so there's nothing Fried can say to change her mind. The prince then storms off in anger, and once he is gone, Elizabeth gets the attention of Fried's knight and asks him to please keep an eye on the prince so he doesn't end up getting tricked by any ill-intentioned individuals. Robert understands what she's trying to say, and he says the prince was probably just too tired from the trip back to think things through properly. Elizabeth sure hoped that was the case because an idea like giving a group of corrupt officials direct access to the royal treasury could have easily caused the decline of the kingdom, and Elizabeth wants to prevent something like that at all costs because when a kingdom declines, it's the ordinary people who suffer the most. A little while later, Elizabeth is preparing to head out because now that she's done with the work for today, she finally has time for a much-needed break, so she asks Mireille to get her carriage ready because she wants to make every minute count. However, before she could leave, her father suddenly comes into the office looking for her. He is here to inform Elizabeth that an emergency meeting has been called in regard to recent monster activity, and the king will have to attend, so as the king's right-hand man, Elizabeth's father will have to go as well. Elizabeth asks when this meeting is scheduled for, and he tells her it's next week, but that's really bad news since next week was meant to be the kingdom's anniversary party. She says they are going to have to cancel the party now, but her father tells her they can't since the guests from faraway places must already be on their way by now. Thus, he says the party will be held as planned, and Elizabeth doesn't see how that's going to be possible with both the king and the chancellor away, but he explains that the king has personally entrusted everything related to the party into the hands of Elizabeth. She is shocked when she hears this and tries to refuse at first, but her father tells her that the king firmly believes that all will go well if she is left in charge, and he has no one else he trusts as much as her, so her father asks her to take on the task, and when he puts it like that, Elizabeth doesn't really have much of a choice. She's a bit upset that she didn't get a chance to enjoy her day off, but there's no time to worry about that because she has a lot of work ahead of her if she wants to make sure the anniversary party is a success. While she's in the middle of thinking about what to do, Mireille looks out the window and notices the prince openly flirting with Sylvia. She was appalled by how openly Fried was cheating on Elizabeth. But Elizabeth didn't really care since it's fairly common for a prince to have more than one consort, and she really doesn't have anything against Sylvia. Her only gripe is the fact that Sylvia was only recently adopted into a baron family, and hasn't learned the proper etiquette for interacting with royals, but she doesn't think it's going to cause any problems. Elizabeth later invites Sylvia to have some tea with her in her room, and there, she politely warns Sylvia that if she wants to pursue a relationship with the prince, then she must be aware of the fact that her behavior can affect not only herself, but the prince's reputation and the reputation of the kingdom as a whole. Elizabeth then points out the injuries Sylvia currently has on her leg, and the reason she's bringing it up is because she happened to find out that Sylvia got that injury while on an outing with a certain nobleman who isn't the prince. Now, Elizabeth is a civil lady, so she isn't going to call Sylvia out as the two-timing host she is. After all, the prince is pretty much doing the same thing to her, so she doesn't care about their messy relationship, but she does care about the image of the kingdom, so she tells Sylvia to refrain from cheating on the prince from now on. Sylvia keeps her head down and apologizes, but as she is leaving Elizabeth's room, she looks visibly pissed about the fact that Elizabeth caught her. At that moment, the prince just so happened to be walking by, so Sylvia got an idea to get back at Elizabeth, and decided to vict him in front of the prince. She turned on the waterworks and pretended to fall over in front of him, and when he asked her what happened, she pointed to the injury on her ankle and told the prince that Elizabeth was the one who did this to her, which leads us back to the present. Elizabeth tries to explain that she has no idea what the prince is talking about, and that aside, she tells him he shouldn't make such a scene when they've got guests from various different kingdoms in attendance today, but the prince doesn't care at all and orders Elizabeth to be sent to the dungeon for attempting to kill his beloved. Elizabeth still doesn't understand what's going on, and neither do any of the guards, but since Robert is the prince's personal knight, he doesn't hesitate to restrain Elizabeth. As Elizabeth is forced to the ground, she catches a glimpse of Sylvia's sly smile, and she immediately figures out that Sylvia was intentionally framing her for this. Pretty much everyone knows what's happening here is absolute BS, but with the king and her father away at the moment, the prince currently has the highest royal authority in the castle, so none of the guards can afford to oppose his orders right now. Thus, Elizabeth simply agrees to go to the dungeon for the meantime. Later on, word reaches the king, and Elizabeth's father receives news of what happened back in the kingdom while they've been gone, and the king is absolutely astonished by how foolish his son has been because he never could have imagined that he'd throw Elizabeth, the most capable woman in the kingdom, in jail over nothing. He wants to return immediately to set Elizabeth free and lay into his son over this. But this is where we find out that Elizabeth's dad really doesn't give a fuck about her because he just found out that she was unfairly imprisoned, and the first thing he did was convince the king that there was no need to go back because he didn't want to waste any time on Elizabeth, so he's basically leaving her to deal with everything on her own. And the king just goes along with it because he assumes her father would know what's best for his daughter. Back in the kingdom, a month goes by with Elizabeth in prison, and she had initially hoped she'd finally get to take a break from all her responsibilities for once. But even though Prince locked her up, he still somehow managed to force all his administrative work onto Elizabeth. A little while later, Mary comes down to see Elizabeth while cloaking herself with magic, and to make sure no one suspects anything, Elizabeth uses hypnosis magic to knock the guard out. She then asks Mary what's going on because she is sure word of this must have reached her father and the king by now, and she expected them to come back to straighten it all out. But Mary informs Elizabeth that her father actually voted to leave her to figure things out, and hearing that strikes a nerve with Elizabeth because her father always leaves her to deal with the dirty work he doesn't want to handle. And the bad news doesn't stop there because Mary also mentions that the prince has begun going after her company as well. He is claiming that the Funnel Corporation was run by a traitor, and now he wants to replace all the executives Elizabeth chose with his own lackeys. Elizabeth thinks this is really bad since that idiot is going to destroy the company and put the kingdom in a bad spot. But Mary doesn't understand why Elizabeth is still thinking about what's best for the kingdom that uses her as nothing but a convenient tool even after everything that has happened to her. Elizabeth agrees that it is infuriating to think about what the prince and Sylvia did to her, or the fact that her own father refused to come help her, but she says none of that is the fault of the people, so she doesn't want to let them suffer. However, Mary has one more thing to report and informs Elizabeth that the prince and his inner circle have been spreading baseless rumors, accusing her of attempting to assassinate Sylvia and take over the country. And even though he has presented no evidence of this, the people have all begun believing and slandering her name, despite all the good she has done for them. And that was the final straw for Elizabeth, so for the first time she says, fuck it, and decides she's not going to break her back for this kingdom a second longer. She then punches the wall to let out some frustration, and she thanks Mary for opening her eyes because she now understands how foolish she has been. She could have broken out of here at any time with how strong her spells are, so she tells Mary that they are finally going to leave this wretched kingdom. All beings in this world have mana, and a select few are able to control that mana to summon things called divine artifacts. Divine artifacts can be anything, including swords and spears, but in Elizabeth's case, her divine artifact manifests as 7 grimoires, and one of those grimoires allows her to record and manifest any type of magic. When the time comes for her to leave, she creates an ice clone of herself so people don't find out about it immediately. After that, she heads over to the estate of Viscount Lucas of the neighboring empire. Lucas recalls what happened at that party, and he is honestly still shocked that the prince would do something so stupid because even a complete fool should be able to see that Elizabeth was the one behind most of the kingdom's successes over the past few years. He really wishes he had someone as capable as her on his side, and to his shock, as he is thinking that Elizabeth suddenly pays him a visit and asks what she is doing. So Elizabeth explains that she is fed up with being used by the kingdom, and would like to seek asylum in the empire. Lucas knows a golden opportunity when he sees one, so he agrees to let her stay in the empire, but he asks what she intends to do while she is here, and Elizabeth explains that she is going to get her revenge by destroying everything she helped build for the kingdom.